Hi, everyone. We'll just give it 2 minutes just to make sure that everyone has enough time to join, and then we will kick off. Perfect. I think let's kick off. Fantastic. Still see quite a couple of people still joining, but let's kick off. Everyone will be sent a recording after the session. Cool. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Jenna Kretzmer, Chief Revenue Officer at Contract Corridor, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Andrea Campbell, Principal Corporate Counsel at Microsoft Africa, who will be sharing her perspective on how organizations are approaching governance at scale. Across pretty much every industry, organizations are scaling faster than ever. They're expanding into new markets, forming new partnerships, operating across multiple jurisdictions, and managing increasingly complex ecosystems of suppliers, customers, and technology providers. But while businesses are scaling quickly, the control environment around contracts often aren't keeping up. And that's where the problem starts, because contract volumes are growing everywhere across entities, regions, and functions. Sales agreements, supplier contracts, technology agreements, regulatory frameworks, it all adds up very quickly. And the real risk here isn't growth, it's unmanaged complexity. But if I had to ask, where do your contracts actually live today? Are they all in one place, or are they spread across drives, inboxes, and different teams? When contracts are sitting across shared drives, inboxes, and disconnected systems, organizations start losing visibility over some of their most important commercial commitments. And that's not just an operational issue, it's a real financial impact. Research shows that organizations lose between 3 and 15% of annual revenue due to ineffective contract management. And if you think about your own organization, how confident are you that none of that is happening today? Because the reality is that loss doesn't come from one big failure. It happens quietly through missed price escalations, through supplier rebates that were never claimed, through auto renewals that were never reviewed, through obligations that were never tracked. How many of those are happening right now, just without visibility? Individually, each of these may seem quite small, but at an enterprise scale, when you're managing thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of contracts, those small gaps start to add up, and very quickly that becomes material. For large organizations, we're not talking about thousands, we're talking about millions in unrealized value every year, which is why at scale, contracts aren't just legal documents. They're actually defining how the business operates, how revenue is recognized, how suppliers perform, how risk is allocated, and how regulatory obligations are enforced. So the real question becomes, are those commitments visible to the people responsible for them? Because when they're not, organizations are effectively operating without full control over their own commercial environment. And that's why the way we think about them needs to change. At scale, contracts are not just legal documents. They are governance instruments and financial assets. And increasingly, organizations are recognizing that contract governance can't sit off to the side as a standalone system. It needs to sit within the broader enterprise environment. Because if your teams are already working in Microsoft 365, why would governance sit somewhere else? When governance is integrated into platforms like Microsoft 365 and Azure, you get visibility and control without forcing teams to change how they work. It becomes part of the way the organization operates, not something separate from it. Today, we're going to explore how leading organizations, what we call frontier enterprises, are approaching contract governance differently. And with that, Andrea, I'd love to bring you in to ground us in the governance realities enterprises are facing today.
Thanks, Jenna. Today, I want to talk about the enterprise reality many organizations are now confronting: complexity, risk, and scale, and why this has fundamentally changed the role of legal. It's no longer about legal as a downstream review of contracts. Legal is increasingly a strategic governance function, helping organizations design, evidence, and sustain control, accountability, and compliance in environments that are more regulated, more distributed, and more scrutinized than ever. So the question is no longer, do we have policies, but it's now, can we demonstrate consistently and at scale that those policies are being followed? This slide right now, you'll see, captures the reality organizations are operating in today. And across jurisdictions, regulatory scrutiny is increasing, not just in volume, but in sophistication. Regulators, auditors, and boards are asking harder questions and expecting clear, defensible evidence. Audit and compliance expectations have expanded, and it's no longer sufficient to say legal reviewed this or the business followed the process. Organizations are actually being asked to show how decisions were being made, who approved them, whether the controls operated as designed. And at the same time, accountability has moved upwards. Boards and senior executives are increasingly personally accountable for the governance failures, particularly where risk is foreseeable but not controlled. And critically, risk is now cross-border by default. Data protection, sanctions, ESG obligations, financial controls. Decisions taken in one country or business unit can create consequences for businesses globally. And this is why governance is no longer periodic, it's continuous. If governance is continuous, it can depend on individual memory, goodwill, or heroic effort, and it must be built into how the organization operates. This is where scale starts to work against organizations, and particularly in contracting. As organizations are growing, contracts are becoming decentralized across regions and across functions. Different templates, different approval paths, different storage locations, all well-intentioned, all locally optimized. The risk is not bad faith, the risk is governance fragments. When governance fragments, no one has a complete picture of what's going on, and the risk starts to accumulate quietly. Typically, we see strong control before signature. So negotiation, review, approval, and then something very important happens. The moment when the contract is signed, control often drops and exposure begins. So post-signature obligations like renewals, pricing, mechanisms, termination rights, compliance commitments are where financial, regulatory, and operational risks actually materialize. And when these obligations live in inboxes, shared drives, or individual trackers, the risks become invisible. And invisible risk is hard to manage. As complexity and scale increases, manual governance breaks down, not because people are careless, but because informal processes cannot keep up with volume, velocity, and regulatory expectation. This is a critical distinction because communication is not control. Email coordinates activity, but it doesn't provide approval discipline, version certainty, or auditable decision record. Shared drives store documents, but they do not establish accountability either. Effective governance at scale requires systemization, embedding governance into how work happens and not layering it on afterwards. So that means standardization. Outcomes are predictable and defensible. Approval discipline, so that accountability is explicit. Version control, so decisions are traceable. And audit trails, so evidence exists by design and not by reconstruction. This is not about adding friction. When your governance is systemized, organizations move faster because the control is clear. Contracts are often treated as legal artifacts, but in reality, contracts are enterprise instruments. Every contract creates multifunctional consequences. Finance, there's the revenue recognition and margin. Procurement, the supplier obligations and the dependency risk. Sales, commercial commitments. Operations, performance delivery. Compliance, regulatory adherence. So the important point is this: risk does not sit neatly in one function, and it's actually distributed, and accountability must be as well. This is why governance at scale must be cross-functional. It must be across legal, finance, and procurement. They operate as connected control partners and not sequential handoffs. Contracts are not legal's problem after signature. They are enterprise commitments. And I want to raise something very important. In today's enterprise reality, defined by complexity, risk, and scale, governance can't depend on good memory, goodwill, or manual effort. Email chains aren't governance, shared drives aren't control frameworks. Contracts are enterprise instruments, and governance must be embedded into how the enterprise operates across functions, across regions, and across the full life cycle. This is the governance imperative. Jenna, do you want to share more on what defines frontier enterprise?
Thanks, Andrea. When we look at how leading organizations manage contracts, one of the most important shifts we see is the movement from storage to strategic control. For many organizations, contract management historically began as a document storage problem. The primary goal was simply to ensure that signed agreements were saved somewhere accessible, perhaps in a shared drive, perhaps in a document repository, sometimes even within individual email folders. As long as the document could be found when needed, the problem appeared to be solved. But if I had to ask, is being able to find a contract really the same as managing it? Because as organizations scale, that approach becomes increasingly inadequate. Contracts are not simply documents. They are the mechanisms through which organizations commit to revenue, cost structures, obligations, and risk exposure. And when those commitments are buried inside static documents, well, organizations lose the ability to actively manage them. So the question becomes, if your contracts are sitting in folders, who is actually managing what's inside of them? This is where frontier organizations begin to operate differently. They shift from treating contracts as files to treating them as structured operational assets. There are several characteristics that define this shift. Firstly, frontier enterprises establish a single source of truth across the organization. Contracts are no longer scattered across departments or regional teams. Instead, the organization maintains a unified view of contractual commitments across entities, jurisdictions, and functions. This ensures leadership teams can clearly see what agreement exists, where financial exposure sits, which obligations must be fulfilled, and which renewals or renegotiations are approaching. Because without that visibility, how do you know what's coming, what's at risk, or where value is being lost? In many organizations, this environment sits within their broader Microsoft 365 ecosystem, where contracts can be governed alongside collaboration, documentation, and operational workflows. Secondly, frontier organizations implement standardized governance and clause control. Templates, fallback clauses, and pre-approved structures allow organizations to maintain consistency while still enabling teams to move quickly when negotiating agreements. The standardization reduces risk, but also improves operational efficiency. Legal teams spend less time renegotiating familiar terms. Business teams move faster through approval cycles. And the organization maintains a consistent governance framework across departments. Because how many times are similar contracts negotiated slightly differently across different teams without anyone realizing the cumulative impact? Third, frontier organizations transform contracts from static documents into structured data. When contracts remain static PDFs stored in folders, well, organizations cannot easily see the financial exposure embedded inside of them. Critical information, such as pricing escalations, termination windows, rebate structures, or service obligations, remain buried inside the text of agreements. But when contracts are captured as structured, searchable data, organizations gain the ability to monitor those commitments actively. They can see upcoming renewal exposure. They can track whether contractual obligations are being fulfilled. They can analyze supplier commitments across divisions, and they can identify where revenue opportunities may exist. And that's where it becomes powerful, because instead of reacting to issues, organizations can start managing them proactively. That visibility allows leadership teams to protect revenue and margin proactively rather than reactively. Fourth, frontier organizations enable executive level visibility. Leadership teams gain insight into contractual commitments shaping the organization's financial performance. They can see renewal pipelines, supplier exposure, contract performance indicators, and compliance risk. This visibility transforms contracts from administrative paperwork into strategic operational intelligence. Because ultimately, how do you make informed decisions if you can't see the commitments driving them? And perhaps, most importantly, contract management becomes an enterprise capability rather than a legal function. Contracts affect the entire organization. Finance relies on them for revenue recognition and cost control. Procurement relies on them for supplier governance. Operations rely on them to deliver services. Compliance relies on them to meet regulatory obligations. When contract visibility exists only inside legal, the organization operates with limited awareness of the commitments shaping its operations. So why would something that impacts the entire business sit in one function alone? Frontier enterprises therefore extend contract governance across the organization. Legal establishes the standards, but the entire organization operates within those governance structures. We often describe this evolution as a maturity model. Organizations typically progress through 4 stages. Stage 1 is document storage. Contracts are simply saved somewhere after signing. Stage 2 is workflow automation. Drafting, approvals, and execution processes become a lot more structured. And stage 3 is enterprise governance. Standardization, oversight, and accountability are actually embedded across the organization. And lastly, stage 4 is commercial intelligence. At this stage, contract data actively informs strategic decision-making. Frontier enterprises typically operate at level 3 and 4. They have moved beyond managing documents. They are actively managing commercial relationships, obligations, and risk at scale. But when organizations remain at the earlier stages, that's when the hidden cost of scale begins to emerge. One of the most misunderstood aspects of contract management is the scale of financial impact. Research consistently shows organizations losing between 3 and 15% of annual revenue due to poor contract visibility and control. For a large enterprise, that can represent tens or even hundreds of millions in unrealized value each year. And if you think about your own organization, how visible is that number today? What makes this particularly challenging is that losses rarely appear clearly in financial reporting. They don't appear as contract failure. Instead, they appear as small operational inefficiencies spread across the organization. A renewal opportunity that was missed, a pricing escalation that was never applied, a supplier rebate that was never claimed, an obligation that was never enforced. Individually, none of these feel